Welcome back to the channel. We're back with our commander deck profile with Grand Arbiter Augustin the Fort. For 4 mana, you get a 2/3 where white spells cost 1 less to cast, blue spells cost 1 less to cast, and then spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast. So maybe you're tired of your opponents playing their big stuff and getting away with it. Maybe you're tired of having fun with the game. Maybe you're just tired of having friends in general. Grand Arbiter might be the commander there for you. Overall, we have a whole bunch of ways to make sure that no one's allowed to play the game at all. Plenty of ways to make sure that we could have an actual way to win the game and not just sit there until everyone decks out because they couldn't do anything and they could only draw cards. And ways to make sure that we could stop our opponents from, getting rid of our stuff that's stopping them in the first place. But that's the general overview of the deck. Let's get into it card by card. Starting off, we have Arcane Signet to get us a little bit ahead on mana, to make sure we could put our opponents a turn behind while we're getting a turn ahead with Grand Arbiter. Azorius Signet for some more mana. Cursed Totem. Activated abilities of creatures can't be activated. Once again, we want, for the first card in this deck, to make it so our opponent can't play the game. We're making so they can't use their activated abilities. A lot of decks focus solely on that. So let's make so they can't. I mean, even most of their removal may be an activated ability. Godpower Statue. Spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more mana to cast, putting our opponents just a little bit further behind. It does cost 6 mana, so we may be in a little bit of a predicament trying to get this on the board in the first place, but if we get enough mana, we could potentially do this earlier, and at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life. So potentially, we only need 40 turns to win the game by just sitting there. Norn's Annex. Creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless their controller pays either 1 white mana or 2 life. Unless you're playing against another white deck, they're not going to have that white mana, so they're going to need to pay the 2 life, allowing you to avoid taking some damage. Soul Ring for some mana. Talisman of Progress for some mana. Vexing Bauble. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, we get to counter it. Makes it so that our opponents can't play their spells for free. Makes it so that we're protected for a little bit. Wayfarer's Bauble, where you get an additional land on the board. Winter Moon, players can untap more than 1 non-basic land or an untap set. What's better than, we play all basic lands and our opponent has all fancy lands and they can only use 1 of them. You'd be quite the mean person with this one. And then Winter Orb. As long as Winter Orb is untapped, players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap steps. Maybe we do have a way to tap this to make so that we could untap our stuff and our opponents can only untap that 1 land. Making so that they don't have mana to cast any more spells, especially if we have stuff like the Cursed Totem Godpower Statue on board, where they have to pay 2 more, making it even harder to cast their stuff. Absolute Virtue, you have protection from each of your opponents, meaning you can't be dealt damage, enchanted, or targeted by anything controlled by your opponents, unless you avoid taking some damage. It's not the best card, it is 8 mana, I mean, really 7 mana, thanks to Grand Arbiter, but overall, just an okay spell. I just like this card. Archon of Emeria. Each player can cast more than 1 spell each turn, making it so that if our opponent wants to pop off, they have to do it a few turns. They can't just do it all during 1 turn. And then non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, making it even harder for them to use that for mana for Winter Moon. Even Mind Sensor. If an opponent would search their library, that player searches the top 4 cards of their library instead. You flash this in so your opponents cast their Cultivate. You flash in your Aven Mind Sensor. Rather than searching their whole deck for those 2 lands, they just search the top 4 for those 2 lands now. Or, if your opponent has any type of tutor, you're just getting in their way, making so that they can't play the game. Zor's Electors, 5 mana for a 3/5. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a filibuster counter on this card. Then, if it has 5 more filibuster counters on it, you win the game. I mean, ideally, you have a way to proliferate this, but in this deck, you don't. You just have ways to stall so you could survive for 5 turns so that they can't get rid of this. And whenever a source would deal damage to you, remove a filibuster counter from this card instead. Ideally, we're having ways to avoid taking damage, and our opponent doesn't have enough mana to cast their stuff to get rid of it or attack us because we have a Sphere of Safety, Norn's Annex, some other stuff, propaganda on the board to make so they can't attack us. Clarion Conqueror. Activated abilities of artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers can't be activated. Another way to show off the activated abilities makes so they can't use their Soul Rings, their Arcane Signets, their Azorius Signets. their talismans, all the stuff that they would normally want to use to get ahead on mana, is now just useless and sitting there like a rock. Contaminant Priest. Flash, if a non-token creature would enter your battlefield, if it wasn't cast, exile it instead. Making it so, say your opponent has a Gift Shot deck, they're cheating all those dinosaurs off the top of their deck. Exile all those dinosaurs that were about to come onto the battlefield because you flashed this in as that ability was activating. Doorkeeper Droll. Flash, flying artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to happen, making it so that, maybe our opponent's just like, oh, I'll search up this card and I'll have my enter the battlefield ability deck. Nope, none of that for you. You don't get to use those. Eidolon of Rhetoric. Each player can't cast more than one spell each turn, making it so that once again, our opponents have to wait to go off until they can either remove this or, something else. Bait Spinner. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, their player chooses draw step, main phase, or combat phase. The player skips each instance of the chosen step or phase this turn. Maybe they don't draw cards, maybe they don't cast spells, or maybe they don't swing at you. All three of those are good abilities, especially if we had maybe a way to copy this. We don't in this deck, but, could be quite mean. Hushbringer, flying, lifelink, creatures entering the battlefield or dying don't cause abilities to happen, showing off your opponent's aristocrat decks along with their blink decks now, getting into everyone's way, making so that only you get to play the game. Lavina, Azorius Renegade, 2 mana for a 2/2. Each opponent can cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands that player controls, aka cost reduction. Artifacts don't help in any way, shape, or form anymore. And whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. While we don't like stuff that costs less, we don't like stuff that doesn't cost anything at all. Leonin Arbiter. Players can't search libraries. Even better version of Aven Mind Sensor, except this doesn't have flash, so you can't react to the search. Any player may pay 2 for that player to ignore this effect, allowing them to not then be able to use a card during the same turn normally, unless they have a lot of mana. Magus of the Tabernacle. All creatures have, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this creature unless you pay 1. Means that creatures don't stick around for too long, especially if we had something like Wintermoon on the board. Super mean. Spell-Tide Enforcer. Whenever opponent plays a spell, that player sacrifices a permanent unless he or she plays 1. That's anytime they want to try to do anything, they essentially have to pay 1 extra to cast it. Otherwise, they're putting themselves even more behind. Tax Collector. Until your next turn, spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast. It does only put them a little bit behind, but still, putting them a turn behind could mean the difference between them having a board wipe and them not. Dahlia, Guardian, Draven. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast, making so that your opponents, and you, in theory, have a hard time casting your stuff. Dahlia, Heretic Kadar. First strike, creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter tapped, meaning they can't, their haste decks are now shut off, and their decks that rely solely on non-basic lands are gone. Laboratory Maniac. In theory, we could potentially just wait until we deck ourselves out, and then we play this card in order to actually have a way to win the game, and not just sit there. Windborne Muse. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 more for each creature they control that's attacking you. I mean, I don't know about you, but most people I play with tend not to have enough mana to do anything about that. Next up, we have our enchantments, which is a good chunk of the deck. We have Aether Barrier. Whenever a player plays a creature spell, that player sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1, essentially making them pay 1 more anytime they want to cast a creature spell. Get in their way quite a bit. Or silence artifacts, enchantments, spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast, making it so that their soul rings are now going negative on mana, their talismans are even more negative on mana. And you sacrifice this card, destroy target artifact or enchantment, means that when our opponent does finally get their Dread Dynamo on board, we just get this out of the way. And this only affects our opponents and not us as well. Back to basics, non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. So if we have them a way to make them enter tapped, and our opponents are only playing non-basics, this can make it so that they don't have any mana to do anything. I cannot read these borders sometimes. But as exhort, artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, making so that it puts them a little bit more behind than they already were. Dissipation field, whenever permanent deals damage to you, return to its owner's hand, meaning that when our opponent finally had the mana to cast their stuff, nope, it's just going to go right back to the hand if they're trying to attack us with it. Dreamtide, right? I think that's what it's called. Creatures do not untap during their controller's untap phase. Each non-token creature's controller may pay an additional 2 during their upkeep to untap that creature. Yeah, most times you won't have mana for that and propaganda, so you're gonna be quite a bit behind. Well, your opponents will. Creatures, yeah. And Frozen Aether, artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponent's control come into play tapped. Another way to benefit there with back to basics, meaning so they have to play those basics. Ghostly Prisons, creatures can't attack you unless they pay 2 for each creature attacking you. They're probably not going to be a cast. This gets quite in the way of haystacks because they're not going to have mana. Most times, people tend not to want to pay the mana in the first place, though. Prison in the Mood. When our opponent finally does get something that can do something, let's make it so they can't. Karmic Justice. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls destroys a non-creature permanent you control, you may destroy target permanent that opponent controls. So maybe they're finally destroying our stuff. No, we're destroying their stuff. Artifacts, creatures, and lands target player controls come into play tapped. This is only target opponent, and it is 4 mana, so it's not the best, but it's cheap. It's only 50 cents. Omniscience. You may cast spells from your hand without paying their mana cost. We may be making everything cost more to cast, but nope. Not for us, for everyone else. Propaganda. Harder to attack us. Rest in peace. Into battlefield, exile all graveyards, getting away graveyard decks now. I mean, I don't think there's any deck we're not in the way of at this point. If a card or token will be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exiled instead, making so that we get in the way of a resting act as well. Rule of law. Each player can cast more than one spell each turn. We've seen this effect, we like this effect. And Sphere of Safety, making it even harder to attack us. So we have this, plus Propaganda, and what was it, Ghostly Prison. That now means it costs 7 mana to attack us with any creature. They're not going to pay that mana. Because then we'll just Aetherize them if they do. Return all attacking creatures to their owner's hands, meaning that we avoid some damage, and we get to put our opponents even more behind. Counterspell, maybe our opponents do finally have the mana to cast something. Maybe we should just let them do that. Or no, maybe we should just counter it. Generous gift for some removal. Mana leak, counter target spell, unless his controller pays 3. Oh wait, I did not scroll over. Whoopsie. There we go. Mana leak, make our opponent pay a little bit more to cast their spells. And it's only 1 mana for us because we do have that cost reduction with Grand Arbiter. Negate for some more counter spells. No more lies. Another counter spell. If a spell's counter spell, exile instead of putting it into its graveyard, makes so that I can't recast it. Pet exile for some removal. Render silent. Makes our opponent can't play spells for an entire turn after we counter their first spell. Rewind. Counter target spell. Untap up to 4 lands. Putting us ahead. Shadowbringers. Dovin's Veto. In other words, another counter spell, and Sword Splashes for that removal. This way, if our opponent finally gets to do anything, no, they didn't. That's right. We have lands, but we always just scroll through lands at the end. Well, not always, most times. Dovin, Hand of Control. Artifact, instants, and sorceries your opponent's control costs 1 more to cast. Until your next turn, prevent all damage that will be dealt to and by target permanent and opponent controls. This way, if they have that one big creature that's been swinging with us, or maybe it's someone who has a Gishat attack that's been swinging with Gishat a whole bunch, nope, no damage for them. Approach to the Second Sun. Another way to potentially win the game by having this cast time and time again, gaining us a little bit of life, and, make us just survive a little bit longer. Austere Command for a board wipe. Once again, when our opponent thinks they finally did something, no, they didn't. Enter the Infinite. Another way to combo Laboratory Maniac. Deck ourselves out maybe. This way we don't have to play the game anymore because no one can cast anything. Supreme Verdict for some board wipe, Time Wipe for some board wipe, and Red God for a board wipe. But yeah, if you dislike this deck as much as I do, make sure you like the video. If you do like the deck, also like the video. If you want to see more like this, or mostly more not like this, make sure you subscribe so you can stay tuned for future videos. But thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.